guys!
Hello!
I'm James Archer. I'm the managing director at 40. I know a lot of you guys. And I originally put this presentation together to mostly help people from outside the design community have some idea what the people inside the design community do, because there's a lot of misunderstanding between the two. And I want to start by just saying that design is not what you think it is. And chances are, even if you're a designer, design is still not what you think it is. A lot of people tend to think that this is design. You know, you're just sort of the hipster artistic kid who just kept wanting to play with crayons forever and never wanted to let them go, just kind of follow their artistic dream and go off that direction. That's not what design is. Design is also not this, which a lot of business people tend to think it is, and just, you know, pay a couple bucks, slap a logo on it, it's design. It's not quite that. And then every once in a while you hear designers kind of talking about how they're going to save the world and have all these highfalutin ideas and, you know, thinking that that's what design is. And the problem is that design is really difficult to explain. The word itself means a whole bunch of different things depending on the context that you put it in. And the words that you would use to explain design are also confusing and vague in themselves. So it just winds up making a big old mess of trying to figure out how do you even explain this in a way that people can understand. It's not a good, solid, tangible thing. It's not like concrete. You can explain concrete. It's difficult to explain design. So the closest that I've been able to come up with is to say that design is a creative and disciplined approach to problem solving. It's a problem-solving thing. It's not an aesthetic thing. It's not a creative or it's not an art form. It's a creative, disciplined approach to problem solving. And we'll talk a little more about that in detail later. So the first level, we're going to kind of start from probably where you're familiar and then dig deeper from there. So the first level is visual design, and that's what most people are familiar with. And there are a lot of different concepts kind of associated with that help solve problems. So for example, one way to solve problems is in visual design is through rhythm and repetition. So here's a good example. You can see the way this ad is put together, it's visually striking because of the rhythm and repetition to it. There's a pattern to the pencils, and even though it appears chaotic, everything's kind of fairly structured. You can see lots of color up here, some color here, big white space in between. So there's sort of a pattern and a rhythm to the way that it's put together. Here's another example of where the pattern is kind of used to create a sense of movement, even though nothing's moving, and a sense of what's happening there. Here's another great one. I thought this was a really interesting ad. It took me a minute to get this one, but now our brains are wired to detect this stuff. I mean, a lot of these are just survival mechanisms. You know, if you're out in the jungle hunting something, you're looking for patterns. And another thing that people look for naturally, just part of the brain, is balance and harmony. This is a really interesting business card that you kind of turn over, and it means different things when you flip it over. This is a great example of sort of a subtle use of balance and harmony. You have one character in the ad down here, another character up there, and they sort of balance each other out in the space of the advertisement, and it creates kind of a harmonious whole. This one is the lack of harmony. So that'd be cool if it didn't do that. They had to stop to tell me that my keyboard batteries were low on my laptop. So this is an example where, to emphasize it, the natural space that it would tend to fill is that. So they intentionally made it not harmonious and not the way your brain wants it, so that it stands out and you notice it more. Come on now. Another thing that is common in visual design, especially even in flat printed design, is a sense of movement. So there are different ways that you can position things, different ways that you can shape things, and use that contrast to create a sense of movement, which again naturally attracts your eye to something. Here's a good example from a classical painting, and this is very common, especially in the classics. They have a very solid understanding of this stuff. They wanted to direct your eye here, so they put the vanishing point right in the center, and all lines in the picture sort of lead right back to that center point. So if you're looking at that picture, it's hard not for your eye to just dwell right there And it almost seems like they have this magical power to just draw your attention to something. And that's all design. I mean, they were trained in how to do that. There are specific processes for doing it. And they know how to put your eye where they want it. Here's another good example in terms of a sense of movement. The reason the motorcycle's over on this side is so that it feels like it has room to move into. If this were flip-flop, and it would look like it's just driving off the edge of the page, and you get sort of the sense of discomfort when you look at it, this looks a lot more balanced and looks like it has room to go. Another common device for visual design is color. There's a lot to color, and there's a lot of information about the different kinds of relationships between colors and the way that those can interact to create different impressions. This is one I like. It doesn't really come out too well here, but it's sort of a nice purple color, but it evokes the color of the grapes. And for a site like this where it's about wine, that color has meaning to the people browsing the website. And so when you use that color throughout, you're creating sort of an emotional connection that they wanted, where if you just picked any two arbitrary colors that happen to look nice, the site will come out okay, but it's not going to have the same emotional connection. This is another good example. If you're a musician, what's the most important thing that you're trying to get people to remember?
Your name.
Your name. You play, they may remember the tune, but they can't buy your CD, they can't look up your website or anything unless they remember the name. So this one was designed brilliantly. The contrast, the only thing that has color is the name, and she's looking at it. And there are a lot of studies that show if someone someone in design is looking at something, you're going to turn and look at that same thing. So everything in here is about look at and remember that name. You guys may actually remember that name by the time you leave. There are a lot of different ways to come at color palettes. So one device we use sometimes is to pick a photo that has some of the elements that we want and pull colors out of it. I just picked two silly ones here, but for example, if you're designing something about tropical beaches, you might take a picture of a tropical beach and pull the colors directly out of there, and those colors will tend to have that meaning and evoke those emotions for people. You may have seen things like this. Color symbolism is a really popular thing. It's kind of an easy way to sort of tell what meanings people associate with different colors. All of this is crap. None of that's actually true. So it's fun, but it's not nearly that simplistic. The way that people process color cognitively is far more complicated than that. Things do have meanings, and certain colors will evoke certain things, but it depends a lot on the context. There's no way to boil it down to make it that simple. Light is another really powerful device that we sometimes don't think about much. This is an example of a billboard, and that's the actual physical light on there that I thought was pretty cool. But here's sort of a more subtle example. You see at the top it's kind of dark, and it tapers and gets lighter and lighter. Our eyes are naturally drawn toward light. So on a design like this, you're trying to get people to read. You're trying to get them to scroll down the page. So with a design like this where it's dark at the top and then white down here, your natural instinct is to go down there. And so they're steering your eye through the page to get it where they want you to be. Here's another example of a website where they use a dark background so the elements on the page pop out more. These wouldn't have the same impact if that were on a white background. And probably one of the most important ones, and one that actually ties in with all the ones we've talked about previously, is the concept of contrast. So when you have something different, it's probably one of the most primal things in our brain is that we're wired to detect anything that's different. It can be different by size, position, color, orientation, shape, texture, and any number of other dimensions. But if it's different, you're going to notice that thing. You guys have probably seen these ads are a fairly classic design, but if you're walking through, a busy shopping mall, and there could be dozens of, posters put up on those little marquee things, but if you see this one, it will stand out because nothing else is designed like that. And so the way that they did it, when it's that simple and there's that much contrast, it's black and white, and then a bold color is going to grab your attention. With only those three colors, there's so much contrast, especially in comparison to what's around it, that your eyes just fixate on it. Here's an example of not using contrast well. Everything on here is trying to be the most important thing on here. So they have this, they have pictures, tons of pictures, you don't know which picture to look at, there's a big headline up there. It's like, we gotta have them look at the headline, we gotta have them look at this, we gotta have them look at this. Then there's an even bigger headline because they want you to look at this. And then that has a sub-headline, big color, so you notice that. Big picture here, dramatically making you want to see more of it. And then, in case anyone missed that, let's put that in an even bigger headline and put that up there. So they're contrasting everything to try and make everything stand out and everything be the most important thing on the page. So what's the most important thing on the page? Nothing. Nothing's most important on there. So they're not telling me where to look. They're not giving me any direction as to what's actually important. Now, going the opposite direction, the Wall Street Journal it has about the same attention priority. I don't really know where to look. It's not that this is necessarily bad. I'm sure they're doing this intentionally. But there's not a whole lot of direction. These stand out a lot. So that's the first thing everyone looks at the Wall Street Journal. And then you kind of go here. But it's meant to be a more intellectual read. So the people who read it want to feel like they're not being directed around. They want to feel like I'm just processing this information. Typography is one of the most important things, but also one of the most underrated sometimes. The font you use says a lot about you. And surprisingly, a lot of people think this is where designers get really annoying and nitpicky and complain about things that don't really matter, is these little things like the shape of that, how long this is, how it curves, how it's cut up, all those things make a really big difference in how you perceive the text that you're reading. Even things like the space between letters, you can't just stack letters one after the other because different letters have different shapes and your eyes perceive those differences differently. So if the letter ended here, that would be one thing, but because it slopes, there's this big white space over here. This one slopes this way, so there's a big white space here. So it looks like there's a huge space between the two. So when you're typesetting headlines or logos, anything like that, you have to pay a lot of attention to these little elements of space. And sometimes the letters technically overlap, but when you arrange it right, our eyes don't process it that way. You sometimes have to arrange it that way so that it creates the appearance of being balanced, even though things are overlapping and kind of all mushed together. One interesting example of this is the FedEx logo, where all the letters are smushed together, but it kind of creates one cohesive whole. I mean, our eyes process this as a single symbol almost, rather than as individual letters that just happen to spell a word. It also makes the arrow kind of pop out a little more, which I'm sure is what sold that logo. The interesting thing about this logo is that it doesn't always work in other languages if they're oriented backwards, and so the arrow's pointing the other way. So another example of where typography can be important, even the tiny, tiny details. This is Arial, and this is Helvetica. Arial was kind of a knockoff version of Helvetica, which is very old typeface that's been used a lot. They didn't, I think it was Windows, when it came out with Windows, they didn't want to license Helvetica, they didn't want to pay for it. So they created a knockoff version that's really similar and just had a couple variations. Now, the problem with the variations is that they sort of destabilize the font. So for example, in this G, you can kind of picture it as like a physical thing that's just sitting on the ground. This sits pretty solidly. This one is just going to kind of roll back and forth. So it doesn't have that same sense of stability. This Q is a nice solid stroke right there. That's not going anywhere. This one, that looks like a pinwheel or something. I mean, that's not going to keep that Q out. It looks like it's going to snap off. This R, this is a nice solid, that's a supporting beam right there. That's going to hold the R up. This one is like this weird awkward angle, and Arial is full of these like awkward angles that don't feel like they're very stable or strong. Same with the one. I mean, this swoops down in kind of a nice quarter circle there, has a nice solid crosswire, and that's sort of it doesn't hold together well. It doesn't feel structured and sound. And the result of that is, if you're reading the text, you're not going to consciously perceive it, but if you're seeing Arial typeset at sites where you can see those letter details, there's this little sense of everything's not quite sitting right, where with Helvetica it's solid and it's just sitting right there. Now these are examples of really minor differences in type design, but those things make a difference. Psychologically, you'll perceive a text differently if it's set this way than it's set that way. Another typography example, someone long ago decided to try and cross sort of an old English script with an Egyptian aesthetic. And they came up with, of course, papyrus, everyone's favorite. So this is an ingenious design. So the type designer who put it together is a very, very talented type designer. He knows his stuff, and obviously he did something because this stuck in people's brains in a way that they can't let go of it. Everyone thinks papyrus is theft. Everyone thinks that like, every photographer in the world thinks papyrus totally represents who they are and what they're all about. It's okay with the Old English and the Egyptian, it kind of has an exotic aesthetic. So, it eventually creeps over into Chinese food. And then, of course, it goes into like refried beans. We're getting a little less exotic. Now it's New Mexico, so we're even domestic, and we're still using it to sort of like vaguely exotic. And now it's just random stuff, just anything we can put in papyrus. It doesn't mean anything. Covered bridges. Nothing says covered bridges like papyrus. Or mortgages. Or women's apparel. Or the Vietnam War. Or Kansas. So I mean, you can get, a typeface should mean something. I mean, it was designed to have a certain aesthetic, but this one is just sort of so random and so overused that it hooks into some deep, dark place in our brain. It makes us think it applies to everything. And anything we want to have that little mystique or that aura of mystery to it, we put in papyrus. Split pea soup, papyrus. Apparently, the bears like it a lot too. So that's an example. Think about the typeface you're using. If you're trying to convey a message, what's the best structured typeface that will help you do that? It's probably not papyrus. If you're doing something that's Egyptian, maybe it's papyrus, but otherwise it's probably not. Texture is another great element of visual design that you can use. This is a great ad from the World Wildlife Foundation. It kind of uses the texture of a hand, so that's a painted hand, to convey the sense of an elephant. And you really get that out of the texture more so than the shape of it. This is another one that conveys the message through the texture. That's a lot stronger message than if it were just simply designed that way on a flat surface. This is a website design that I like that they use textures from actual travel things. It's a travel website. But they'll use little stickers and stamps and little pieces of paper, like the kinds of things you accumulate when you travel to convey that sense of travel. So they're almost like little symbols that creep in. And speaking of symbols, we can attach a lot of meaning to specific symbols. This is actually an ad for an ad agency, sort of extolling the virtues of doing something not arbitrary. So we have Castro over there with his lollipop and their kind of thing. Maybe we can find something that says what you're about a bit more than just whatever you happen to have in your mouth at the time. This was a bit more risque one that they did. This was a good one. So they're positioning, this was a kind of a short run sandwich that they had, but they're positioning it as a sandwich for experts. Not sure exactly what that means, but they conveyed it well through the symbolism of books. So if you're the kind of person that reads books, you should eat this sandwich. Here's another example of using symbolism in photography to convey a message. It's kind of an odd message. I mean, that has all sorts of... You could spend a long time interpreting what that means for a vote. I'm not even going to comment on that one. But overall, visual design is not about making things pretty. It's very easy to make things pretty. So as a designer, a client comes, they want their website to look pretty, you can knock that out in like an hour. But if the website is going to stand for something, if it's going to have meaning, if it's going to actually hook people's brains and pull them in and really get that message across in an important way, you have to focus on all those little details. There are tons and tons of little details. And that's the discipline of design. So when you're talking to a designer, someone who's actually a serious designer who studied their craft and knows this stuff, these are the kinds of things that they're thinking about. It's just going through their head a mile a minute naturally, and it's sometimes hard to see that. So when they present a design to someone as a client, the client goes, well, I want it to be purple because I like purple. Well, there was a lot more thought put into it than that. And that's where designers get frustrated, kind of going back and forth, because it's hard to explain all those things as we were talking about before. So the next level of design that I want to talk about is experience design, which is going beyond just a visual medium to sort of shape an overall experience that someone has. For example, there was an entrepreneur whose wife had kind of mild arthritis and had trouble using one of these. So he started exploring and trying to figure out, being an entrepreneur, he's thinking maybe there's a product opportunity here. And he started testing different things that she could hold easily and get, hold comfortably. And eventually settled on a bike handle and realized that a bike handle is a great form factor for something like that. And so he invented this, which you guys have probably seen. These are the Good Grips kitchen devices. And made a killing on those just by rethinking the problem and coming up with a new experience that everyone had taken for granted. Every potato peeler before that looked just like the first one. And so now, when you go into a store, you'll see all kinds of variations of this. But all it took was just rethinking the problem a bit and trying to create an experience rather than just assuming that all these things were a given. He did the same for cheese slicers and came up with this, and there's a whole set of other things just by rethinking given assumptions. Another example is a juicer. So Philippe Stark came up with this juicer, but this is a different kind of experience. This is actually a really crappy juicer. But his premise was it's not meant to squeeze lemons, it's meant to start conversations. So in that sense, he was thinking beyond the experience of have lemon meat juice to I've got a dinner party over here and I've got my friends coming over and I want them to go, man, that's a crazy looking lemon juicer you have right there. And that starts a conversation and it strengthens relationships. So he's thinking well beyond just this transactional sense of I just need to juice the lemon as best I can. And a lot of times the most practical and utilitarian things that we have are sometimes the least useful in terms of the overall experience because they don't take everything into account, they're just taking this little transaction into account.
I really like that.
What's that?
I said I really like that.
You should buy one. I think they're only a couple $100. Are you guys familiar with this? Anyone know what this is?
No.
Yes.
Yes.
Trust yourself. Yes, that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if you think down here, these are the basic things. So down here is where you need to juice a lemon. And up here is the kind of stuff you're getting at. You're trying to impress your friends, trying to build stronger relationships, you're trying to express yourself, and this lemon juicer is all about who I am. So it's this kind of stuff where most consumers are. Most consumers in the United States are not really down here anymore. We have a pretty high standard of living. Everyone here has a roof over their head. We're kind of in this area. So most of the things that we do in terms of experience aren't about this transaction of making things happen. They're about identity, they're about affiliation, they're about aspiration. It's all this stuff up here that makes us tick and makes us buy the things that we do. Think about what car you drive. Some of you guys may be down here and just needed something to get you from point A to point B, but a lot of you are up here. You bought a car because of some of these things. This is one of the most iconic examples of experience design in American culture. There's nothing better than a bottle of Coke from a glass bottle. It's like the perfect experience in every way. And they know that, and they've kind of built it into our culture, and you can see how they use it. So it's in their logo, and then it's here, and then it's here, and then they have two over there. If you go through the Coke website, it's all glass Coke bottles. And they pounded this message home for years through advertising and other means to where it's just this iconic American experience for us to drink Coke out of a glass bottle. And they take all kinds of different angles on it, so they've managed to infuse a lot of different kinds of meaning into it. So it doesn't mean just one thing, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. This obviously has a different connotation than the Santa Claus one and the previous one. And then we have kind of the family side of the polar bears, and it's kind of cute and all that. So they've sort of ingrained this experience into our brains, and they've done it so powerfully that we don't realize that that's not there anymore. Because we don't really drink Coke like this, do we? We drink Coke like this. And it's this crappy, awful, cheap experience, but they've imprinted that other experience so much on our brains that we remember that when we're drinking it. And we get this crappy can of Coke from a beat-up cardboard box, and we think we're drinking out of that glass bottle. So once the iPhone came out, there was a pretty quick trend that all of a sudden all phones look like the iPhone. And you can kind of see that even as the iPhone progresses, it's kind of steering toward this one archetypal perfect form of what a phone is, which is basically the monolith from 2001. It's eventually just we're going to all be holding black rectangles up to our head. Interestingly, this also comes as an action figure. So one of the interesting things about this experience, though, is that even though all phones start to look like this, we still have this. Every one of those phones has an icon that looks just like this. And anytime you go on a website and you're saying, call me, give us a call. It looks just like that. My kids don't even know what that is. They've never seen that. So why are we using that when all phones look like this? It's part of the experience. It's imprinted on our brain. We have these cultural imprints that have occurred over the years that it creates context for us, and designers have to work within that context. It's not as simple as just, it's a phone, so you put a picture of the phone you're using on there and you can make a call. You have to create something that means phone. It's symbolism. And part of a designer's craft is to understand all these different kinds of symbolism, all these different cultural references, all these different things that tie together to create meaning, and then to intentionally shape that meaning to create an experience for the customer. So this is a typical retail experience. So you go into a supermarket and you're faced with this. And supermarkets are ingenious at experience design. They probably put more detailed research into it than almost anyone, because they have to get you through here and have you pick up a lot of those things without getting overwhelmed. And so they steer you through the store. When you walk in, you smell all this delicious fresh bread. They probably make very little money on fresh bread. Fresh bread is not where they're making a killing. But when you walk in and you smell that, it changes the chemistry of your brain, and your psychology puts you in a different mood and kind of prepares you to go through this experience. Then of course you get to the fruit section and everything looks beautiful and healthy, and they put all their most beautiful stuff right out front to kind of create this experience and set the mood as you're walking in through the store. Now, most Americans just kind of walk through this section and get to what they're actually getting, which is probably something more like this. So you run out of milk all the time, you need milk for your Cheerios. So they put this all the way in the back of the store, so you have to walk through the entire store to get to it. And then of course, they'll flip-flop it, so if you're going into a new batch, you never know where it's going to be, so you have to kind of walk through even more of the store to get to it. And that's a tiny fraction of the kind of thinking that they put into moving you through the store. And they literally have tracking cameras to watch people move through the store and observe behavior and see how, a change of color here makes someone turn down this aisle. And, they watch all that movement, measure it, track it, and make changes accordingly. Starbucks is another great example of an experience-based design. Starbucks isn't about coffee, it's about what it feels like to be in a Starbucks. And they've spent a lot of time carefully crafting that experience. And, they provide coffee and stuff along with it, but really you sort of create this like a Starbucks experience in your head, and when you're creating Starbucks, really what you're creating is that overall experience, not necessarily just the coffee today. This is a great example of experience design. Does anyone recognize this one? Urinal. Yes, this is a urinal where they had trouble with drunk guys peeing all over the place. So they painted a little fly in there, and all of a sudden all the guys are aiming perfectly. So experience design, which is sort of this superset of visual design, involves a huge amount of different things. We've talked about a lot of things, but it's culture, it's art, it's basically all this random stuff in our brain, and a designer's trying to stitch all those together to create meaning and create an experience that you follow through this process that will stick with you, that you'll value, that you'll remember, that you'll want to tell other people about. And there are a lot of different steps to doing it. So this is not an easy thing where, a genius designer just sits down and this great idea pops out of their head. There's a lot of methodology that goes into coming up with this stuff. I had a friend who once said, I'm a designer like the guy who created the highway system, not the guy who painted the stripes on it. And that's where we're starting to get at what real design is. It's not painting the stripes, which is a lot of times the misconception. I was talking with someone today. They're building this big web application. Their brand is terrible. Their experience is terrible. All this stuff's terrible. But he said, well, we're going to build the application, and we just need someone to skin it once it's done. Well, the application itself is the experience. That's where you need the designer. You need the designer before you need the programmer, not to put a pretty face on it when you're done. So now we're going even deeper than that. So I want to talk about design thinking, which is really the core of what a designer does. And most designers may express that visually, but it's starting to come out in a lot of different areas. And there are now, schools of management that are run like design schools based on design principles. So in a typical scenario, say you're a middle manager at a Fortune 500 company. You have two options. So you evaluate cost versus benefit. Cost versus benefit. you kind of decide what's important to you, and you make a decision. That's absolutely typical management thinking. You look at the criteria, you weigh it out, you make a choice. And that process is called convergence. You have two options, and they converge down to one option. And that's how you make decisions. Design thinking is about divergence. So you have two options, and you start to throw other stuff into the mix. You throw other things out there. Throw in new people, new ideas, new perspectives, even just a different approach. You scrap the old way and start thinking about a new way. And what happens is you come up with new options. That's what design thinking is. It's divergence. You've taken two and diverged into having now three options. There's a great quote by George Bernard Shaw. You see things and you say why, but I dream things that never were and I say why not. That's design thinking. And it tends to look a lot like this. This is the process of divergence. It's what comes out of brainstorming sessions. It's not necessarily easy to run a brainstorming session. A lot of times it works differently than people assume that it works. But if you get a group of people who know how to do this and how to go through this process, or a good moderator who can take them through that process, you can come up with a whole lot of crazy ideas, many of which are actually viable options that someone stuck in management thinking mode was never going to come up with. So you have option A, cost, benefit, option B, cost, benefit, but you get this new option C just by putting new pieces together that all of a sudden gives you a significant strategic advantage. That's why a lot of corporations are now starting to value design thinking outside just the context of visual design where it was traditionally relegated. And design thinking is really this process of divergence and then convergence. So before you just weigh the options you have, take a crack at making new options and then focus on deciding. Typically, a design process follows a pretty set structure. You'll see these if you look at any design firm, brainstorming firm, if you look at IDEO, every time they talk about their custom process that they've invented over the years and perfected and refined, it's basically just this process with different words. Usually they'll try and make them all start with the same letter to be really cool and sound like they put some thought into it. But essentially you define the problem, research the problem to get some new context. Sometimes in researching you'll find, we have this target audience we didn't realize we had, or we have this technology just sitting in a warehouse somewhere that we never realized we could use. Then you use that and sort of explode out, generate a lot of new ideas, and start prototyping things and see what works, because a lot of times what you assume is going to work is not necessarily what's going to work. You have to test out even crazy things to see what happens. Then you implement it, and then you review to see what you can learn from the implementation process, and see if you can pull information out of that to actually refine it further. Einstein said that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And it's easy to kind of get bogged down in metrics and numbers and stuff when you're doing that kind of testing and review. And part of the weird thing about design and what makes it so hard to explain is that it's not as simple as numbers in a spreadsheet. It takes the human brain to be able to process this. We have a really big supercomputer up here, and when you learn to use it and to be able to handle all these ideas in your head at once and move them around and connect them in new ways, you can instinctively figure things out that you may not practically be able to explain. And sometimes that instinct, when it's developed well over the years, is really where the best answers come from. Now, CEOs hate that because that's the opposite of what the CEO wants. The CEO wants a clear, defined action with proven ROI, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where designers and managers sometimes butt heads. So to be successful, designers really need empathy and understanding. So they have to be able to hold conflicting ideas in their heads in a way. You may believe one thing and I may believe another, but if I'm designing for you, I need to put myself on hold and put myself in your head and work around what you believe. They need imagination, they need a sense of prototyping and iteration, so a willingness to try things out and see if they fail rather than creating this perfect little baby that you don't want anyone to criticize. You need collaboration and diversity. That's the divergence. You just need new ideas in there, even if they're completely ridiculous ideas. The completely ridiculous idea is going to kick off another idea that's maybe not so ridiculous. You need constraints so that you have some idea of a framework that you're working within. And you need systems thinking, which is basically thinking a couple moves ahead and thinking about the outcomes of things rather than just the next step. I can I can design this and make it pretty and my boss will approve it, or I can design something that's actually going to work. I'm going to have to fight with my boss to approve it, but then it works really well, and then I get some benefit from that years down the road. So going back to the original premise that design is a creative and disciplined approach to problem solving, there is a specific process to design, and it has different names and different words and different people describe it, but it's essentially a single process of divergence and convergence and the steps that go along with that. And regarding the point we talked about earlier about design saving the world and how ridiculous that is, design thinking is really the only thing that can save the world. It's the only thing that will generate new options. New options will not come from management type thinking. You need design thinking to come up with that stuff. So that is Design 101. At some point I'll come up with Design 102, which will really melt your brains. Do you guys have any questions? Yes.
Kind of entering the lines then here. I'm a developer, and we're actually looking for a designer right now. And you were talking about the management style of thinking, butting heads with the designer. Well, as a coder, we look at UI.